Into the Pit hooked me immediately when I first started playing it, but the game didn't keep me playing as long as I hoped for a couple of reasons. So let's get into it. Into the Pit is a chaotic FPS roguelite where you use upgradable magic spells to clear rooms in an arena shooter-like fashion. The retro art style and theme gives it an old-school Doom-like feel at times, while the gameplay itself reminds me heavily of Ziggurat. While you can play slowly if you want to, I personally enjoyed playing through the game with raw W key, and the game felt fast-paced as a result. The combat is really the highlight of the game for me, and it just has a really high fun factor when I first started playing because of that fast-paced nature. At the start of each run Into the Pit, you select your magical weapons for your left and right hands, as well as a starting general passive. The weapons are all fairly straightforward projectile patterns, but there is some variation in range, firing pattern, etc. I usually use a more fast-paced, spraying weapon in one hand, and a long-range, more sniping weapon in the other. The goal of each run is to clear 4 floors to get to the final boss, and each floor has 4 rooms to clear. To clear a room, your goal is to interact with and channel all the altars that are present in the room. To do that, you do have to kill enemies to get to them, and not die while channeling them, but it's not a clear enemies to win type objective. In a system reminiscent of Hades, you select one of 2 rewards for each room, and these rewards are usually some currency that either helps you within a given run, such as stacks of blood that give you an extra life if you have enough of them, or a currency that helps you across runs, such as gold lets you buy upgrades that I'll talk more about later on. You might have to explore a bit to get all the currency for a given room, but usually it's pretty easy to find all of it. Each room itself is really quick, taking about a minute each, but the run as a whole usually takes about half an hour. The room system works well with the game, though it does add more loading screens than necessary. Outside of that currency, each room also lets you select one reward, one upgrade when you clear it. You always have a choice of 3 upgrade categories. One upgrade for both weapons or hands. For example, one upgrade might make your left-handed attacks do poison damage, and one passive or general upgrade. One of those upgrades might increase your movement speed, for example. There are some limitations in these upgrades, so you can't stack condition effects for the same hand, and these upgrades are just not balanced super well. For example, there's one upgrade you can get that increases your weapon damage a flat 20%, but there are other increases that do less percent increase, say 10% damage, and they're conditional. So it's just a worse upgrade as a whole, and that doesn't really make any sense. In terms of the runs themselves, they take place in different areas. You slowly unlock new areas by unlocking new runes, and each new area has a different theme, different enemies, and a different final boss. You can also combine 2 areas into one to create a new hybrid area that has both enemy types and features from both areas. And that sounds really cool and interesting in theory, but it's kind of just okay in practice. Also, speaking of the room layouts themselves, the game likes to have a lot of surprise enemies hiding behind corners. And it's kind of unfortunate because these enemies hiding behind corners make you not want to play the game as fast-paced, but the game is the most fun when you play it the fast-paced way. So it feels like the game's almost fighting itself a little bit there. But it's not a big deal either way. Finally, the game is janky and not super polished. I actually played the game for the first time on release day, and there were actually a ton of bugs then that were pretty major. Most of these bugs have been fixed, the most annoying ones have been, but there are still some there, such as sticky walls, that just diminish and lessen your immersion of the game as you play it. And they can also make you lose a game if you get stuck on a wall and surrounded by enemies. These bugs are not a deal breaker for Into the Pit, but they do make the game less fun, less enjoyable. Now let's talk about RNG and randomness in Into the Pit. And this is probably the biggest area where the game falls short. While the combat feels super fun at first, after a couple of hours of playing, if that, you start to see the repetitiveness of the game. Enemy types across areas can look different, but each area has an enemy type that fits a certain archetype. There is a hidden enemy, there's a flying enemy, there's a charging enemy, you get the idea. There are, of course, some differences across different areas, such as different enemies that have different status effects, different range projectiles, and I actually quite like the visual design of most of the enemies in the game. But the limited, meaningful enemy variety across these area or biomes made the game grow stale a lot quicker. Along similar lines, all areas basically had the same level skeleton with different wallpaper, with the exception being the final boss area, which has some more unique layouts. So while there are technically 16 different areas, it feels like you've basically seen all of them after a couple runs. Similarly, the boss fights all follow basically the exact same pattern, which is obviously not great for variety's sake, and those can get a little stale as well. In addition to the upgrades being unbalanced, as I mentioned earlier, there just isn't that big of an upgrade pool. After a couple runs, you've basically seen all the upgrades the game has. And the only powerful synergies in the game are super obvious, like an upgrade that increases your poison damage duration, so it lacks any sort of creative build crafting. Because of that limited variety in all these areas, You're never really hurt by the randomness in Into the Pit because that RNG just doesn't meaningfully affect a lot of things in the game. Now let's talk about progression Into the Pit. The main horizontal progression in the game, the main unlocks that add variety, comes in the form of unlocking new runes that let you explore new areas or biomes with their new enemies, etc. As I talked about earlier, these areas often feel like more flavor differences than meaningful gameplay ones, but you do need to clear a certain number of areas to save a certain number of villagers in order to unlock the final boss area. And on that note, this game has a weird feature where once you clear the final dungeon, you cannot go back to the town and keep playing the game. So if you want to play the game again, try out different areas that you haven't already, you have to start a new save file, which is incredibly annoying. And it makes me feel like the developers don't entirely understand how people play roguelites. Outside of that, the game has some moderate vertical progression in the form of upgrades. Before you start each run, you can equip up to 6 runes that have modifiers ranging from increased health, increased currency gain, or prioritizing certain upgrades in your upgrade pool to allow for some limited build crafting. The only runes that I found to be really important was one of the healing ones, which made the game so much easier, almost to the point of being trivial. I wouldn't say that this game is ever actually that hard, but once I got my upgrades online, I only really died if I clipped into a corner or if one of the later, stronger enemies one-shot me with a melee attack. One thing that I will say about this vertical progression is that it's never ever difficult to unlock what you want, so the game does not have a lot of grinding, which is definitely a plus. I always have a concern in games that make me choose between in-run buffs and cross-run currencies, as this game does, so I don't want to do farming runs. But there was never a case in Into the Pit where I felt like I had to farm to get that progression that I wanted, mostly because of how little progression there actually is in the game. And finally, there is no form of difficulty levels or ascensions to climb. There is no further gameplay once you beat the final boss, and also, you can't play on that save file anyways, because, as I mentioned earlier, the game kicks you out. In terms of the narrative and story in Into the Pit, I was actually optimistic about this game when I first started playing, because it had a nice background that fit the world, and I felt like it had potential. You follow your cousin to this town that is a host of these magical dungeons, and the town alderman has gone evil, and you have to fight against him and save the town, basically. Pretty quickly, though, I came to the realization that most of the story is just told via these occasional one-sentence lore pages. Because of that, Into the Pit joins most roguelites as a game absent of any meaningful story. So what's my verdict on Into the Pit? The game has an incredibly fun core combat system, and the level design meshes with that. I actually enjoyed most of my time in this game because of that core combat alone was just fun. However, the game suffers heavily in many other areas. It needs more variety in enemies, maps, upgrades, and the game lacks polish, and you encounter various bugs and wall clipping a lot more frequently than you would like. Because of that, Into the Pit just doesn't have that replayability that you would expect from a good roguelite. I wouldn't be surprised if most players tap out after only a couple of hours. I think that Into the Pit was a great game for me to play on Xbox Game Pass. I didn't pay any extra for it, but I would not recommend picking it up at the full $15 price tag because you just won't get enough game time out of it. Huge shout out to all of our channel members. I really appreciate all of your support, and it helps make videos like this one possible. Please like this video to help me out in the algorithm, and thanks for watching.